Hello, everyone. We are back for another episode of Book Talk, part of the Geeks and Barbells world. I wanted to talk about something that is near and dear to my heart, something I realized as I grew older, as I matured, so to speak. Uh, I was very much of the mind as I was, um, when I was a young whippersnapper, that the best thing to do, the most interesting thing to do, is to read as many books as possible. It is to get every possible book that I can get my hands on and keep reading because there's this amazing world out there that I don't want to miss out. It's FOMO, that fear of missing out. And I still believe that to a small degree that is true. I mean, there is tons of really interesting stories out there, and it kind of sucks to miss out on those stories. That being said, you will never be able to read everything. It's impossible. You will never be able to watch everything. You will never be able to play every game out there. There's always something more. There's so many books out there. And even if you only hyper focus on one genre, so let's say we only read fantasy or we only read science fiction or we only read whatever thrillers, you still will never probably be able to read even all the books in that one genre, much less if you have more of a wider breadth of interests. So at a certain point, you just need to accept the fact that you can't read it all. And that brings me back to the fact that many times, and I think most people can attest to this, that when you find a really great series or just a singular novel, rereading it helps you to appreciate it more. A great book makes it that when you come back to it, when you reread those same chapters, you understand the characters more. The fact that you know what's already going to happen in the future helps you to look back at something you may have forgotten, because obviously none of us memorizes every line of dialogue within a book. And so we come back to it, and then knowing our perspective of what happens in the future, you see this character and you go, wow. You really start to sink your teeth into who they are. It helps to broaden your perspective of that character. It also helps you as a person to understand someone else more, because books help you to see into the minds of another person. Now, granted, it is generally speaking one author who is making up all these characters, but that person is drawing from their own life, their own knowledge of the people around them to create these characters and their own personality. So you get to see what it is to be another person in a completely different situation than you've ever been in your entire life. And rereading helps you to really pull more from that character. And of course, you tend to see more of the world. You understand more its development. You see more of the detail. And so rereading, I find, for myself, is probably one of the most important things people can do in the world. And this has been common when you look at, for most of human history, most people had either zero access to books or very, very little, because there simply was not that many books around, and most people didn't have the money to be able to buy those books. And so what most people did was they reread over and over again. And when they didn't have books, what did they have? They had access to storytellers who would repeat these same stories over and over and over again. Why? Because there were truths within these stories. There were things to learn, perspectives to gain. And so people reread or re-listened over and over and over again. And I feel like in our society now, where novelty is there at the snap of a finger, where people just go on the internet and they're just looking, constantly looking for new things, especially these short form videos and little things where it's as fast as possible, just read this so I can get to the next one because I want something new. People are losing sight of that. um, I have nothing inherently wrong, I have nothing inherently against, excuse me, reading new things, but there is a lot that you can gain from just going back to things that have really touched you already. Um, there's a reason why scripture is read again and again and again and again. It is to deepen your understanding of the scripture, but also this understanding that as you grow older, as more things happen to you in your life, as you gain more experience, you will pull new things from the scripture. And the same thing happens with books. There are books I've read, especially nonfiction, where the first time I read them, I could barely understand them because the scientific topics or the philosophical thoughts were too advanced for me, we shall say. And then 2, 3, 4 years later, when I've read many other books who have touched upon those same topics in different ways, and then I came back to that book that I could barely understand, and now I was able to understand it much better, and I could pull something from it in a way that I could not before. But I only was able to do that by coming back to it eventually, by understanding that a reread was important. And I don't think people really grasp that many of the times. A lot of times, even when people are rereading a lot, they do it more so out of, just because they love a novel or because they're annoyed that other things are not to their liking, but they don't come to it with that idea that when I reread this, I'm going to really, really deep dive into it. People are not taking notes on their books many times, especially when you're looking at fantasy and sci-fi, things that are more read for pleasure in general. But I think it could help people a lot to reread a book with much more of an eye to the detail and what you can learn from that book, instead of thinking about it just as a novel that you're reading just to pass the time or because it's enjoyable. But you're reading this with the idea that you are going to actually learn something about life from it and how to improve yourself as a person. Not many people think of it like that. And I believe that is a loss for us. One of the most interesting concepts I'd ever seen, even though unfortunately I stopped it because I didn't fully get into it. I don't recall the name exactly, but there was a podcast done by I'm not sure if they were a couple, but they were two people who were going to read the Harry Potter novels as though they were scripture. So they would read a chapter or multiple chapters, if I recall, and then they would think about what was written in those chapters and how they could be applied to life and the metaphors within them and what we can learn from them. And I thought it was a phenomenal idea. The only reason I didn't continue with it is because I'm very sensitive to voice and I kind of didn't like their voices. But it was a great idea. It was a phenomenal idea, and I believe it was one of the first times that the thing that kind of put that nugget in my head, even though this was many years ago, or at least 2 or 3 years ago, that I heard this and I kind of forgot about it. But the more I've kind of grown over these last couple of years, the more it's kind of stuck in my head, that idea that is super, super important. And so I am recommending to people that if you're going to constantly be thinking that you need to get a new book, kind of take a step back and think, hey, maybe, just maybe, I would get more out of just rereading something I already have that I really like, that I enjoy, or maybe something I tried reading before and I was interested in it, but I couldn't really grasp it at that point. Well, maybe now's the time to reread it. Or maybe you could use that as a guide to what you're going to read next, as something that you can help improve your understanding so you can come back to that novel and learn more from it. I think it's possibly one of the best ways we can learn. There's just something about learning from a book, even if it's a fiction novel, that is just infinitely better than learning the way a lot of people learn, which is school or just randomly online, because we learn much better from stories. It's how we've learned for most of human civilization. We learn through stories. And so many people look at fiction as kind of just a thing you do for pleasure instead of an actual educational experience, which is strange because we do learn from fiction novels such as like Shakespeare, but we only do that for old classics. We don't do that for many of the extremely fascinating science fiction and fantasy novels, and even other styles of novels as well, that we can pull huge educational knowledge from because they're done in an interesting story mode. So we're losing out a lot on that. So I think rereading for educational purposes is extremely important. I think just as a way to improve ourselves and even to just simple enjoyment, we can get so much enjoyment out of a good reread of a book. Even one that we might not have liked so much at the beginning. It's sort of like when you eat a food and you're just like, it's not really my thing, but then you eat it a few more times and your palate develops, and all of a sudden that food that you couldn't really appreciate the taste for at first, you suddenly do like it. And that can happen with books also. Many of us, when we're younger, we read a novel or a genre and we don't really appreciate it when we're younger, but so we never try to read that style of genre again when we're older. Whereas we might have changed as we got older. We might be able to appreciate it now much more because of how things have changed in our lives. So I would definitely think about rereading a lot more. Look at it much more as a way to improve yourself and educate yourself, regardless of whether it's fiction or nonfiction. So think about it. If you like my little thought process, let me know down below. Comment, like, subscribe. Check out the website, geeksandbarbells.com. You can check us out on Insta. And just enjoy yourselves, because books are awesome. Everything's awesome. Life is awesome. Especially when you've got cool posters like this. Spirited Away. I love it so much. Okay, bye, peeps.